One step past.
Glad scientists. Aluminum Man, Charles Martin Hall. If anyone deserves superstar status, it's Charles Martin Hall. His contribution to civilization is extremely significant. Where would you be without aluminum? Still, his name is not as famous as other scientists and inventors like Thomas Edison or Albert Einstein. What he went through to make aluminum widely accessible for everyone is beyond belief. The childhood of Charles. Charles was born on December 6, 1863, in Thompson, Ohio. His father, Herman, was a minister. His mother, Sophronia, met Herman in seminary school. Together, they worked as missionaries. Before Charles was born, the Hall family had spent many years in Jamaica. Charles was one of 8 children. Perhaps his closest sibling was older sister Julia Brainerd Hall. She was a chemist who helped Charles in his research. Julia was also an artist of still life paintings. Charles and Julia became quite the team as adults. His education began at home. Charles' mother, Sophronia, taught him to read at an early age. By the time Charles was 6, he was reading his father's 1840s college chemistry book. Undoubtedly, this is what kick-started his interest in science. It wasn't long after this that he was hooked on Scientific American magazine. Charles did have some other interests. He liked classical music. He was also a collector of porcelain and oriental rugs. However, science was his special lady. Charles started going to public school at age 8 and breezed through it. As a kid, science was his life. He conducted all kinds of experiments in the kitchen and the woodshed that was attached to his house. By the time he was 16, in 1880, he enrolled at Oberlin College. His destiny was calling. It was in Hall's second college term that he attended Professor Frank Fanning Jewett's lecture on aluminum. Aluminum was the most abundant metal on Earth. However, it had only been discovered in 1825. Today, everyone takes aluminum for granted. Why not? It's long been considered a cheap metal, and it has an infinite number of uses. You may be surprised to find out that in over half a century after people knew about aluminum, it was extremely expensive to produce and considered about as valuable as silver. Why was aluminum so hard to produce? No one could figure out a way to separate the aluminum metal from the bauxite ore. Professor Jewett made the remark that if anyone should invent a process by which aluminum could be made on a commercial scale, not only would he be a benefactor to the world, but he would also be able to lay up for himself a great fortune. This was Charles Martin Hall's defining moment. He took Jewett's words as a personal challenge, turning to a classmate and proclaiming, "I'll be that man." From then on, Hall and Professor Jewett would be great buddies. Charles had long desired to be a successful inventor and entrepreneur. This was a project worthy of his attention. But why go through all the trouble in the first place? What makes aluminum so great? Aluminum is lightweight and flexible. It's also resistant to corrosion. It's a conductor of electricity and heat. Aluminum is completely impermeable. For example, when you wrap something in aluminum foil, even as thin as it is, nothing will get through it to the item inside. It's definitely not like cheesecloth. Theoretically, it's 100% recyclable and doesn't lose any of its natural qualities. No other metal can be recycled quite as well. This isn't to say that aluminum is the end-all metal. It does have limitations. For one, it's a weak metal. Aluminum does not attract magnets for that reason. This feature can be considered a benefit or a drawback depending on how you want to use aluminum. However, it's a metal that can be easily dented and scratched. It also requires special processes to be welded. In addition, aluminum can affect the way your food and beverages taste. Everything in this world has its advantages and disadvantages, but you have to admit that aluminum has a lot to work with. Good luck, Chuck! Hall began his experiments in finding an aluminum reduction process in 1881. He worked in Jewett's laboratory. At home, his base of operations was on the third floor of his family's house. This came to an end, however, after an accidental fire. Charles' parents gently persuaded him to move to the woodshed behind the house. He didn't know it at the time, but this is where he would eventually make history. He tried many things, but he just wasn't getting it. Charles' older sister, Julia, was his assistant and a great help to his ultimate discovery. She would also be important to Charles keeping his discovery. That came later. Charles graduated from Oberlin College in 1885 and still hadn't found a way to reduce aluminum. He knew he was onto something, however, because he knew what wasn't working. Professor Jewett urged him to keep working on it. Jackpot! It was on February 23rd, 1886, that Charles Martin Hall made his breakthrough. His work is not the easiest thing to explain. Charles was heavier on the chemistry side of things than technology. The equipment he used was just a means to an end. He would ultimately need to improve upon both of these things to make his idea commercially viable. To make it simple, Charles put a chunk of red bauxite clay in a bath of cryolite. Cryolite is actually a mineral that has many uses, but was used as a solvent in this experiment. Then Charles ran electric current through it. This is referred to as electrolysis. After that, the cryolite would dissolve the clay and release the aluminum. The aluminum would come out, in puddle form, in a little catcher called a retort. Finding the answer to this difficult problem would be the first obstacle Charles had to overcome. What he had to go through after this really separates the men from the boys. Back me up! On July 9th, 1886, Hall filed for his first patent. Why did he wait so long? Charles was looking for financial backers, someone who could help him produce aluminum on a large scale. Applying for patents takes money and time. There was no reason to go any farther with that if there wasn't any hope for his idea getting off the ground. This certainly wasn't an easy mission. No one in Ohio was willing to stand behind Charles. Did they not have the money or the confidence? Charles beat the bushes and turned the stones, but he wasn't getting anywhere at home. In March of 1886, less than a month after his discovery, Charles had his brother George, a minister in Boston, look for someone who would back his project. George turned up a judge and a businessman. It seemed like a good idea at the time, so Charles finally went for his patent. For whatever reason, this partnership failed. It was a blow, but the pain didn't last long. Charles had an uncle who got him in touch with two brothers from New York State, Alfred and Eugene Cowell. These two were metallurgists to begin with and had a better understanding of Charles' work, more so than non-scientists. The Cowell Brothers. Charles wouldn't know it yet, but the Cowell Brothers turned out to be real snakes in the grass. Here's something fun you can do. Every time you hear me say Cowells, I want you to boo real loud. Try it on for size. Cowells. Lockport, New York is where Charles went to work for the Cowells Electric Smelting and Aluminum Company. He worked for the Cowells from 1887 to 88. This was a real awkward relationship. At first, it seemed like the Cowells wanted Charles real bad. Charles wasn't with them for long before he found out that they didn't want to put any money into the enterprise. The Cowells didn't even want to pay Charles' wages all that much. It took Charles a long time to get paid. The equipment Charles was using was crude, and the electric current was too low. His relationship with the Cowell brothers deteriorated to nothing. The Cowells weren't very eager to produce pure aluminum. Maybe the brothers wanted it too soon and needed more patience. Whatever the case, the Cowells dropped Charles' option, and he was out of work. Charles' time at Cowell's was not a total waste. A man by the name of Romain Cole, who was general manager at Cowell's, liked Charles and was confident in his abilities. He told Charles about a man named Captain Alfred E Hunt in Pittsburgh, who was also a metallurgist. Captain Alfred E Hunt. By this point, Charles Martin Hall had gone through a lot for his love of aluminum. He couldn't have known it at the time, but the advice Romain Cole had given him on contacting Captain Alfred E Hunt would seal his fate. This is when good things started to happen. Here's another fun thing I want you to do. Every time I mention Hunt's name, I want you to say, "Yay!" real loud. Let's give it a test run. Alfred E Hunt.
Yay!
Cowell Brothers. Charles met Hunt, and things happened quickly. He put on a demonstration for Hunt and 5 other industrialists just to show that he could, in fact, reduce aluminum with his process. They were effectively blown away.
Whoa!
Later in 1888, Hall, Hunt, and the 5 other businessmen formed a company. It was, at first, called Pittsburgh Aluminum Company. They didn't like that name, so they changed it to Pittsburgh Reduction Company. That was no good either, so in 1907 they changed it to Aluminum Company of America. After that, it became best known by its abbreviation Alcoa. This company became the stuff of legend and has enjoyed a lengthy legacy. Hall became vice president of the company. Lawsuits, Part 1. Paul LaRue. While Charles was going through everything with the Cowell brothers, Captain Alfred E Hunt, in the early days of Alcoa, there was something else he had to deal with in the background. Lawsuits. This was pretty troubling, especially given the fact that he didn't break the law. The first legal opponent of Charles was Paul LaRue from France. How did a mild-mannered guy from Ohio upset the French? This would all prove to be very, very weird. Paul LaRue and Charles Martin Hall shared some incredible similarities despite the fact that they were 2 very different people. Both of them were born in 1863. Both of them died in 1914. And at the same time Charles was making his discovery of the aluminum reduction process in Ohio, so was Paul while in France. The 2 men did not know each other, and were not even aware of the other's existence. LaRue was furious to find out that this American was claiming credit for making his discovery. The question was, who first discovered the process? Litigation between the 2 young inventors went on for over 2 years. It went to the courts and, worst of all, it held up Charles Martin Hall from receiving his patent that he applied for in 1886. The originality of Hall's work was attacked. If Hall lost, it would have changed everything for him. LaRue had already received a French patent on April 2nd, 1886. However, he applied for a U.S. patent in May of that year. Charles didn't file until July. Under U.S. patent law, patent rights required proof of the date of discovery. It was a good thing that Charles had family and friends to back him up. If not for them, this case might have dragged on longer, and Charles could have lost. Charles' sister Julia became the key witness of the trial in late 1887. Not only was she Charles' assistant, but she had prepared a 6-page document describing the history of his aluminum invention. This document became a valuable piece of evidence. By the way, Julia was also quite the secretary. She maintained order of the letters Charles wrote and those he received during the whole time he was working on his invention and afterwards. Julia had kept copies of the letters Charles wrote. She was quite a sister. Everything Julia supplied was important, but especially the copies of the letters Charles wrote to his brother George in Boston. There were 2 such letters, postmarked, that were most important. One was written on the day Charles made his discovery, on February 23, 1886, telling George all about it. The second letter was written the day after, posing questions to George as to how he should proceed with his invention. Bingo! Add to this the testimony of Professor Jewett, another professor from Oberlin, and Charles' father, and he had the winning hand. Paul LaRue simply did not come up with the idea first. Charles won. Hall still didn't receive his patent until April 2, 1889, nearly 3 years after he applied for it. As a nicety, this process has since been called the Hall-LaRue process, but let's get real. It's the Hall process. As the saying goes, Charles may have won the battle, but he didn't win the war. Charles Martin Hall would be no stranger to courtrooms after this. Each time, Charles didn't do anything wrong. While all this went on, he was still working with aluminum in building up his business. LaRue didn't have the passion for aluminum that Charles had. After his loss, he concentrated on steel and did very well for himself. The Adventures of Alcoa, Part 1. While Charles was still waiting for his patent, Alcoa was all set to proceed. The first thing Alcoa wanted to do was build a plant where Charles could do what he wanted to do on a big scale. The plant started production on Thanksgiving Day, November 28, 1888. Charles and his young assistant, Arthur Vining Davis, were in charge. Because of Hall's process, the price of aluminum dropped in a big way. For the first time ever, aluminum became extremely affordable for many practical uses. Charles held a lot of stock in Alcoa, and he became very wealthy. Alcoa was the first major producer of aluminum. In his life's journey, Charles realized that he had to be as much of a businessman as he was a scientist and inventor. He had to protect his work. He also had to keep perfecting his process. It was important to Charles that he had people around him he could trust to some degree. Aluminum was his life. It was all he did. This might be at least one reason why Charles never married or had children. Another plant was opened in 1891 in New Kensington, Pennsylvania. This did well for Alcoa, but the crown jewel was yet to come. In 1893, Alcoa signed a contract with the Niagara Falls Power Company. They would build a plant that was like nothing they or the world had ever seen before. Things were starting to get fun for Charles, but he would face another roadblock. Lawsuits Part 2, the Cowell Brothers. Paul LaRue wasn't really a bad guy. He worked hard on his discovery too and wanted to protect it. When he took Charles Martin Hall to court, it was a patent interference case. If you thought someone was trying to take credit for your work, you would probably do what Paul did. The Cowell Brothers, however, were dirt. They didn't want to help Charles at the time he was working for them and struggling to get his idea off the ground. After Charles finally made it at Alcoa and was banking large, the Cowell Brothers tried ripping off his success. The problem with this idea is that Charles, after winning his patent in 1889, sold his rights to Alcoa. The company was already big, and the Cowells were playing with the big boys now. In 1891, the Cowells were advertising pure aluminum and were promptly sued by Alcoa, then called Pittsburgh Reduction Company, for patent infringement. The judge was William Howard Taft. He would later become President Taft in 1908. In January 1893, Judge Taft ruled in favor of Alcoa and, by extension, Charles Martin Hall. The Cowell Brothers had hired away one of Alcoa's employees, a chemist by the name of Hobbs, who was the foreman in Pittsburgh. Hobbs had inside information about Hall's process and how to do it. Very dirty stuff. Years later, in 1903, the Cowells won a countersuit. Taft wasn't the judge by that point. They shouldn't have won anything, but back and forth lawsuits was the MO for the Cowell brothers. One of these was bound to take. The surviving brother, Alfred, got royalties and almost $1.5 million settlement. He stopped working in aluminum after that. Don't let this bum you out, though. Alcoa and Charles Martin Hall didn't take much of a hit and would continue to do very, very well. The Adventures of Alcoa, Part 2. The eagerly anticipated Niagara Falls plant in New York was completed in 1895. This became the first industrial smelter in the United States and was truly everything that Hall had ever wanted. It was a huge, huge facility compared to what he had been used to. Technologically speaking, the equipment didn't change much after that in Hall's lifetime. Hall was a bit more concerned with perfecting his process, lowering the costs, and making it a more affordable business. Some of the Hall-era pots were still being used until 1952. In 1905, Alcoa would make the granddaddy of all investments. Back in the early 1890s, an area in south-central Arkansas was discovered to be an incredibly huge deposit of bauxite, the ore from which you get aluminum. The General Bauxite Company and some other local producers had been mining the area until Alcoa bought them out. Alcoa purchased vast tracts of land, and for several decades, Bauxite, Arkansas, receiving its name in 1907, was the richest supply of aluminum in the country. Bauxite, Arkansas. This was never a major city. It saw population booms when the mining activity went up, and population drops when mining activity went down. In its heyday, Bauxite had over 7,000 people. It's a shame that it had to happen this way, but business really boomed for the town and Alcoa during World War I and World War II, when aluminum was in extremely high demand. Throughout the Great Depression of the 1930s, Alcoa paid their employees in bauxite very well. At the time, it was hard to beat the money Alcoa was paying. It was fleeting, however. An expanded source was found in South America. Although Bauxite, Arkansas was still important, they weren't the only game in town. Both Alcoa and the Reynolds Metal Company, the second biggest player in the aluminum industry, continued to mine the area. Reynolds dropped it in 1981. Alcoa ended up buying the Reynolds Metal Company in 2000. The town of Bauxite, Arkansas still exists. It may never become a major metropolis, but it has things going for it. The population has floated from around 400 to 700 people in the last several decades. At the time of this video, there is an impressive community center and museum. There is also an established school system with an elementary, middle, and high school, all in the same small town. A lot has happened over the years, but Bauxite, Arkansas will always owe a debt of gratitude to Charles Martin Hall and Alcoa. The later years of Charles Martin Hall. Charles never rested on his laurels. He continued to improve upon his research and development for the rest of his life. Ultimately, he would receive 22 patents. He also served on the Oberlin College Board of Trustees. Charles also happened to be the college's biggest ever contributor. In 1911, Charles won the Perkin Medal. This was the highest award an American scientist could receive from the Society of Chemical Industry. This ceremony was also the first and only time Charles Martin Hall and Paul LaRue met face to face. If there were any hard feelings, they were mostly blown over. Paul himself was quite successful in other endeavors. Charles considered this award one of the highest points in his life. Charles Martin Hall died on December 27, 1914, in Daytona Beach, Florida. The cause of death is believed to be leukemia. He was only 51 years old. You're the greatest, Charlie Hall! Charles Martin Hall was extremely generous with his fortune during his lifetime. In 1901, he had bought a house in Oberlin for 3 of his sisters, Julia, Louie, and Edith. This is now called the Hall Sisters' house. His sisters also had Alcoa stock and continued to make a lot of money until they died. After Charles died, he continued to give. Oberlin College got most of his material possessions. His family's house, that they lived in until 1901, is now called Hall House and owned by the college. The woodshed where Charles made his discovery was demolished in the 1920s. Oberlin College also got 1/3 of his Alcoa stock among other investments. Much of the rest of his fortune went to charity. In 1929, Oberlin College got a statue of Charles Martin Hall. Appropriately, it was made of aluminum. It still exists today and is in the chemistry department. Due to its light weight, friendly pranksters used to move the statue around the campus. It went on like this for decades. Nowadays, the statue is attached to a block of granite. Charles stays put these days, but that doesn't stop the college from dressing him up for special occasions. He's been outfitted as everything from a baseball player to the Easter Bunny. What do you know that's made of aluminum? Mr. Hall, as brilliant as he was, could never have anticipated all the ways aluminum would be used. Smartphones, tablets, laptops, flat-screen TVs, all of these electronic devices and many others have been made with aluminum inside and out. Interior designers have taken a liking to aluminum. Many furniture items including tables, chairs, lamps, picture frames, and much more have been manufactured. The one use that probably everyone recognizes is for the packaging of food and drinks. The Coca-Cola and Pepsi companies have been using aluminum pop cans since 1967. You may not realize it, but one of the major uses of aluminum is for transportation. Its lighter weight means it can move easier. In turn, less fuel is needed. Planes and trains have been using aluminum for a long time. The auto industry has long relied on steel, but over the years, aluminum is starting to be used more. It's also a popular metal in the world of construction. In 1931, the Empire State Building in New York City became the first building to widely use aluminum. And how often have you heard about aluminum doors and siding? As mentioned earlier, aluminum is a great conductor of electricity. It doesn't conduct electricity quite as well as copper, but its lighter weight makes it ideal for long-distance power lines. Plus, aluminum's resistance to corrosion protects it from the elements. What does the future hold for aluminum? New uses for it keep popping up all the time. Charles Martin Hall certainly made a worthwhile contribution to society and was one of our greatest glad scientists.